Hello and welcome back. This is the bed preparation workshop. Today we will talk about preparing your bed or your planting area for growing vegetables. So the first thing we're taking into consideration, let's jump right into it, is calculating how much space we have in our planting area for the actual growing of vegetables. So there are two ways to really look at how much space you've got in your planting area. One is a more linear style or a linear way of thinking. It's thinking in terms of row feet. Row feet is how many feet are in the row that you are trying to plant. How many linear feet are there in the area where you're trying to plant? Now, let's say, take for example, our beds here at Firebird Farm. Typically, we have 100-foot long beds. The beds might be 3 feet wide, but there's about 100 row feet in that bed. If we were planting a single crop in that bed. Take, for example, tomatoes. If we were to plant tomatoes in that 100-foot, 3-foot wide bed, tomatoes generally are planted only one line per bed. That is because they need to be trellised, and it makes it easier for them to harvest or to be harvested. So because of that, in our 100-foot long, 3-foot wide bed, tomatoes generally can receive a spacing of between 16 and 24 inches between each plant. We can get about a little bit less than 100 plants in that bed. I can't really do that kind of math off the top of my head, but it will be less than 100 because there's 100 row feet, and each plant can be spaced at a minimum of 16 inches apart. So we'll have a little bit less than 100 plants in that bed. If we were planting a crop, say peppers, for example, peppers can also be planted about 16 to 24 inches apart from each other. However, typically in a 3-foot wide bed here at Firebird Farm, we plant 2 rows of peppers, down that same bed. So let's say we're planting our peppers at 16 inches apart. I'm just going to guesstimate here, we'll get 80 plants per row in that bed. But we have 2 rows of peppers in that 3-foot wide, 100-foot long bed. That means we will have 160 peppers in that 3-foot wide, 100-foot long bed, if my math is correct, which it most likely isn't. So take those 2 examples. We have a 3-foot wide, 100-foot bed of tomatoes. Because of the way the tomatoes are planted, we can have a little bit less than 100 tomato plants, let's say about 80 tomato plants. If we were planting peppers in our 100-foot, 3-foot wide bed, we would be planting about 160 plants because of the way that the peppers can be spaced in that bed. I hope that makes sense. Thinking about calculating your available space based on these criteria is one way to think about how many plants you can fit in a certain space. It's more about linear feet than it is about anything else. Square feet is a different type of looking at your field or looking at your planting area. This is sometimes called square foot gardening. It's coined by people who do biointensive gardening. And doing square foot gardening basically means that you're creating a grid in the area that you are going to be planting. And each box in that grid will be 1 square foot. So take a typical raised garden bed made out of wood. Let's say it is 3 feet by 6 feet long, 3 feet wide by 6 feet long. That means we've got about 18 square feet in that bed. So we would have 18 boxes, 18 little boxes in our grid in that garden space. Now to take it a little bit deeper, to plant in your square foot gardening method, your first step, like we said, is to make your grid. How many square foot boxes can we make in our planting area? Now, it's not to say that one plant is going to be occupying one square box or one square foot or one box in our grid. Certain plants can be spaced closer together, while some need more space between them. Take, for example, a zucchini plant. A zucchini plant needs 24 inches between each plant, typically. However, a beet only needs 4 inches, between the next beet plant. Or between each beet plant, there only need to be 4 inches of space between them in order for them to be growing efficiently. Now, when we're trying to determine how many plants we can fit within our gridded space, I find it much easier to look at how many square inches are in our space rather than looking at how many square feet are in that space and trying to do a fraction of, beets take 4 inches and that is 1/3 of 12. So we're not going to do all that crazy math. I think it's a little bit easier to look at each square foot, each box within our grid as a 144 square inch space. Now, if I was to plant beets in my 144 square inch space, beets need to be spaced 4 inches apart. We want to try and find how many square inches each beet, or if we were doing other plants, each plant would occupy. Because beets need 4-inch spacing, we are going to multiply 4 by 4 and get 36 square inches. That means each beet plant needs 36 square inches. Now that we have that figure, we can easily plug that in to 144 square inches, which is the size of our one box, one small box in our grid. So we can do 144 divided by 36. That's a fairly simple equation. That equals 4. That means that we can fit 4 beets at 4 inches apart per box in our grid. Take a different example. If we were doing zucchini, which need 24 inches, which need to be spaced 24 inches apart from each other. 24 inches by 24 inches is, off the top of my head, I cannot do that. Let me get my calculator. 24 by 24 is 576 square inches. One zucchini plant needs 576 square inches. I'm going to divide that number by 144. 576 divided by 144 equals 4. Each zucchini plant will take up 4 of our small boxes within our grid. Take a different example. Peppers. Some people only plant peppers at 12 inches apart, especially for smaller plants like hot peppers. Some varieties of hot peppers don't grow quite as large as other varieties. If we have a plant that only needs to be spaced 12 inches apart from another plant or from the next plant of its same type, we can fit 1 plant per box in our grid. So let's look back at what we've just thought about. We have our garden bed divided into a grid. Each box in our grid is 1 square foot. In each of those square feet, we can fit 4 beets. One pepper plant can occupy another box in our square feet, in our grid. However, if we were to plant zucchini, we would need to save 4 boxes in our grid for that zucchini plant. This hopefully helps you get an idea of what square foot gardening is all about. Here is an example of square foot gardening and in terms of the plant spacing. You can see that broccoli would require a whole box, whereas a carrot, you could put 16 plants in each box. If we have an 18 square foot raised bed, that's just one raised bed, one wooden frame in our garden, we can fit 18 times 16 carrot plants. That is quite a lot of carrot plants. If we look at things in the square foot method, using the square foot method, we generally can fit a lot more plants per space, per square inch in terms of a space in general. Whereas if we were planting in row feet or linearly, we might have more space between plants because of how we orient our garden. There's going to be more space laterally. The rows of each plant are going to be spaced farther apart than they will be in the row. For example, peppers. This is a Jedi jalapeno pepper seed. And when we are transplanting, we are setting transplants 12 to 18 inches apart in rows. However, the rows Johnny's recommends to be 24 to 36 inches apart. That means we could fit even one more row of plants in the middle of our bed if we were using the square foot gardening method. However, using the linear row feet method, we would be able to fit a whole row less of those plants. We would only be able to fit 2 rows in our 3 foot wide bed. I hope that makes sense. Typically, when people are doing raised bed gardening in a wooden box, they can use this square foot gardening method to get more bang for their buck, to get more vegetables out of a small space. However, it may be more difficult to cultivate or weed between those plants because they are so close together and it's hard to fit implement in there, such as a hoe or some sort of hand trowel to kill those weeds because there are so many plants to watch out for. You have a higher risk of damaging some of those plants. If you are using the row foot method, here is a picture of our collard green plants in 2018. We were able to fit 2 rows of collard greens at about 24 inches apart in this 3 foot wide bed. We used plastic mulch so we didn't have to cultivate in between them. However, this picture here, there is a large space between these rows of green plants. I can't really tell what they are because the picture is so low quality. I do apologize. But you can imagine that at this scale, one person is not using their hands to pull the weeds. They are probably using a large piece of equipment such as a tractor. Now, because we're using a tractor, we have to give the tractor space to operate in between the plants in order to kill the weeds. So planting in row feet is a suitable strategy for certain situations. Planting in raised or in a square foot method is suitable for different situations. Depends on how are you pulling weeds? How much food are you trying to get out of your space? How much labor do you have? All of these kinds of things should play a role in whether you decide to use row feet or square feet to determine how many plants you can fit in your planting area. Knowing how many plants you can fit in your planting area is very helpful because it will allow you to start as many seedlings as you need for the season without having too much or too little. And that has really great effects on profitability and efficiency and the use of your resources, which is your money. Now that we've just determined how many plants we can fit in our space, we want to think about designing our garden. What is it going to look like? What is going to go where? What is going to grow where? An important principle of organic growing is crop rotation. Crop rotation helps break pest and disease cycles and aids in nutrient management. Growing a different family of crop each year in a particular field is what crop rotation is all about. An ideal crop rotation plants the same crop type in a field 5 years later. For example, if tomatoes are planted in 2019, 2014 is the next time tomatoes will be planted in that field. Now, this is an example of a very long rotation, perhaps suited to much larger scale farms where there's the ability to rotate in and out of quite a bit of acreage for certain crops, and the ability to let some area of your field or of your farm rest perhaps, or grow in cover crop for an entire year. It's not perhaps the easiest to do this in a situation where you don't have a whole lot of space and you're constantly having to grow food on every single square foot of your property. These fact sheets are extremely helpful if you're interested in learning more about crop rotation. The USDA crop rotation tip sheet, and the NRCS crop rotation resource. Now, when we are rotating crops, the most important thing we need to take into consideration is the crop family, or the family of vegetables that the crops we are trying to plant belong to. This slide gives you an exhaustive list of the most common types of vegetables and their botanical families. Brassicas, such as cabbage, broccoli, turnip, radish, and collards, belong to a different family than lettuce and endives. Cabbage and broccoli belong to the Brassica family. Lettuce and endives belong to the Asteraceae family, or aster family. This is an important distinction because a lot of people tend to think that leafy greens in general belong all to the same family. Swiss chard is a relative of the beet and the spinach plants. That means Swiss chard is in the goosefoot family. So we have named lettuce, Swiss chard, and cabbage, for example. All of these are leafy green vegetables. However, they all belong to 3 different families. This helps us out when we're trying to do crop rotation because it allows us to grow leafy green vegetables using crop rotation, because we don't have to worry about all of those leafy greens being in the same family. If our collard green field had a beautiful harvest of collard greens last year, we could plant Swiss chard perhaps next year. And if that field is really good for harvesting leafy greens, or that's a field that warms up quickly in the spring, which allows you to transplant things like Swiss chard and cabbage or collard greens early in the season, you can use these different families to rotate 3 years of leafy greens into that same bed. The first year can be collard greens, the second year can be Swiss chard, and the third year can be lettuce, and you will still be rotating your crops. So use this sheet to help you understand which crops belong to which families, and that will help you get an idea of how you can switch between growing certain crops in certain times of the year, or over different years or different seasons. However, in an urban space, which most of the folks who may be listening to this are operating in, there is really not enough space to do longer 4-year-plus rotations. In an urban space, perhaps you have a deal with a restaurant. The restaurant really enjoys your Bibb lettuce. They want your Bibb lettuce all year round. You are growing on a 1/4 acre in the middle of the city. That's quite a big piece of land for the middle of the city. However, this restaurant is ordering thousands of heads of lettuce from you each week. How are you going to keep up with all of that demand without growing your entire farm in lettuce? While growing your entire farm in lettuce may be a good idea for your short-term profitability, the nutrients that are going to be sucked up by the lettuce will be the exact same nutrients every single time you plant lettuce. Unless you're amending your soil very, very regularly, you will most likely encounter nutrient deficiencies after a while if you keep planting lettuce in the same space. Furthermore, if you keep planting lettuce in the same space year after year, there is a high chance that your lettuce plants will develop a disease that may risk you losing your crop for years to come. These are all things that we can try and avoid through crop rotation. Now, although we're in the city and we're operating in a very small space where we're constantly being demanded to grow something, for example, lettuce, there are a few ways for us to get around this while still rotating our crops in some way. Managing short rotations. So introduce diversity whenever possible. Plant different varieties of lettuce if lettuce is grown multiple times per year in the same growing space. Grow green lettuce in the spring. Once that lettuce is done, grow romaine lettuce, then grow red lettuce, then maybe do a salad mix. Although they are all in the same family, they are, because the varieties are different, you will be changing, you will be adding to the diversity, you will be changing the types of diseases that those plants are susceptible to. Even the different varieties of lettuce have different susceptibility to different types of diseases. Now, planting different types of lettuce is going to help you out in that sort of situation, although you're still dealing with the issue of nutrients. Consider crops whose roots explore different spaces in the soil profile. Lettuce, for example, occupies pretty much the top 6 inches of the soil profile, or the top 8 inches, let's say, just to be safe. Planting carrots in between the rows of your lettuce can be a useful way to get more food out of your space, but will also help the nutrients in your bed to be used in a different way. The carrots will use different nutrients than the lettuce will. So adding a different type of crop, because carrots explore deeper into the soil profile, that can help mitigate some of the effects of not rotating your crops. One, because the roots are going so deep into the soil, they will bring up more nutrients closer to the surface that the lettuce will be using in your next plantings. Furthermore, just having a different type of crop in there can be helpful in terms of breaking pest cycles, breaking disease cycles. Having carrots may be a great hideout for ladybugs. If your lettuce has a problem with aphids, which I'm sure it will, after multiple years of planting only lettuce in your garden, having those carrots around to attract those ladybugs will help break that aphid cycle, because those ladybugs will be preying on those aphids. Planting a crop that explores a different area of the soil profile is a very helpful tool to manage short rotations. Between your plantings of lettuce, you can also plant a wide variety of crops that are not in the aster family. Lettuce is in the aster family. You can plant Swiss chard, you can plant beets, you can plant carrots like we just said. None of those are in the aster family. Undersowing a cover crop of a different plant family once the main crop is nearing maturity. You can plant a cereal rye crop, cover crop, as as your lettuce is reaching maturity or after it has been harvested, the action of planting that cover crop, hopefully it's not in the aster family. Let's say it's a cereal rye. It will not be in the aster family. Planting that different family of crop on that area that has grown lettuce for a while will increase the diversity of the types of roots that are exploring the soil there. It will bring more nutrients to the surface. It will break disease cycles by destroying that environment where maybe lettuce diseases are harboring themselves and their populations are starting to grow. Planting that cereal rye cover crop will change the environmental aspect of that raised bed. It will change what's going on there. It will change the types of insects that it attracts. It'll change the microbial activity in there. It will change the amount of the types of nutrients that are being used by the plant as well. Undersowing cover crops so that they are established either before harvest or immediately after harvest is a really great way to sort of break that cycle between perhaps similar crop type plantings. Adding diversity at any stage of the game here is what we're trying to get at. Any window of diversity that you can introduce into this area where you're constantly being demanded to grow lettuce, that is going to help you out greatly because it's going to increase the diversity that's going on in your garden. Plant 2 crops of lettuce immediately after each other to maximize the length of time when lettuce is not growing. So let's say you plant a spring crop and then a fall crop of lettuce. You can try and plant a spring crop, and then 3 weeks after you plant that first spring crop, you can plant another crop in the spring. And then let's say your demand isn't to feed a restaurant all year long, it's to grow X amount for a wholesale. You only have to produce X amount for that wholesale, let's say 100 heads, to meet the terms of your contract. You can get all of your lettuce harvested in the spring by planting 2 succession crops, 2 crops that will be growing at the same time, but at different stages of maturity, and that will help you knock out your lettuce harvest target for the year in that early time. And then that will leave you the rest of the year to plant something else that is not lettuce. So planting 2 crops immediately after each other, and then changing the crop type after that that you're planting in that area is a way to get more lettuce, more of the same crop type without prolonging the amount of time that that lettuce will be growing or that same crop family will be growing in that area. I hope that makes sense. Please ask me questions about that. Increase scrutiny of soil health. So ensure there is sufficient nutrient content and organic matter to feed the next crop. Do more frequent soil tests. Consider amending more frequently to meet the crop's needs. Soil testing is going to be an extremely important thing if you're trying to manage a short rotation. Like we talked about, repeated plantings of the same crop type or same family of crop are going to use pretty much the same nutrients in the soil. So ensuring that the soil has enough nutrients to continue growing healthy lettuce plants is extremely critical if your business is lettuce. I hope this gives you some tips and ideas to manage short rotations in a smaller space, especially since we try and grow the same things pretty much every year. Although we may have some wiggle room, it is very difficult to rotate crops in an urban space. We're just trying to add diversity at any step of the way that we can. Using these techniques hopefully will give you a way to do that. Companion planting. When we're designing our garden, we can also think about what types of crops do well together. Now, there's not a whole lot of scientific research on companion planting. A lot of it is mostly anecdotal. A lot of companion planting charts that I've seen online are contradictory. Now, I'm sure there is a lot of real scientific phenomenon that affects how plants do when they're planted in close proximity to each other. Now, I don't think we completely understand how these things work yet as farmers or even as scientists, but we can use these guides to sort of help us along the way, use someone else's anecdotal experience to, to try in your space and to see if it works. And if it works, then that's great. If it doesn't, you can try your own companion planting techniques to see what crops do well together in your space. So the gist of companion planting is that certain plants can improve or hinder the growth of others if planted near each other. Successful companion planting organizes plants so that good companions are planted close to each other. Companion plants can improve the flavor of nearby plants, deter pests, or provide a more comfortable environment for their neighbors. For example, people say that basil planted near tomatoes improves the flavor of the tomatoes greatly. People say that planting carrots near tomatoes improves the health of the tomato plants. People say that planting onions or garlic pretty much around anything is a helpful deterrent for aphids because of the smell that the garlic and onions emit, which is not pleasant to many insects. Additionally, we talked about how carrots might create an environment for ladybugs and might create a ladybug habitat amongst our very aphidy lettuce. Creating that environment by planting carrots amongst our lettuce will help reduce the aphid population on our lettuce because we will be attracting predators of the pests that we are trying to deal with. Certain plants should not be planted close to each other because they attract similar pests and are susceptible to similar diseases. When companion planting, consider planting crops that occupy different soil depths to avoid competition. Example, plant carrots near tomatoes. Carrots have a taproot. They grow very deep down into the soil. Tomatoes generally hang out in the top to middle areas of the soil profile, and therefore don't really go for the same moisture, the same nutrients that tomatoes are going for because they occupy a different zone in the soil profile. However, companion planting may make crop rotation more complex. As you're planting a lot of different crops in a very small space, it may be more difficult to rotate those crops because generally companion planting allies are different families of crops. So that may make it more complicated if you're trying to rotate beets into a bed where you interplanted your Swiss chard with tomatoes. Beets and Swiss chard are in the same family. It would probably be unwise to follow a crop of Swiss chard, although it was interplanted with tomatoes, and follow that with beets, or to follow that with beets. Here's a beautiful picture of companion planting. Folks say that nightshades and things in the aster family, Apiaceae family, like this lettuce, do really well when planted next to each other. Basil is also here, this purple basil in the foreground. That also helps improve the flavor of some nightshades, some folks say. And then these beautiful yellow and orange flowers, which are planted all over the place, those look like marigolds. On the right, there seem to be some, perhaps that is echinacea, or another sort of black-eyed Susan, perhaps. I don't know, that's not what it looks like in the bottom right corner. But either way, it looks like there are a lot of marigolds for sure in this space. People say that marigolds generally deter most garden pests. They do definitely deter nematodes, or at least that's one thing that is a very common statement. Marigolds deter nematodes. So this is a beautiful picture of what companion planting might look like in your space. Interplanting different types of crops. The lettuce will be harvested in about 60 days, while the eggplants will take more than 90 days to reach maturity. So that can add a different dimension of planting to your space as well. Here's a link to the Farmer's Almanac Companion Planting Guide. I don't really recommend any particular one. I don't think that many of them really have scientific basis, but they're fun to try out, and you can see and by taking notes and records throughout your agricultural career, you can understand the relationships between different plants, hopefully. Maybe we can add some anecdotal knowledge here. When you're designing your space, it is also important to consider your light. How much shade is being cast on your space? Is there any shade being cast on your space? Is it in full sun? How will the plants that you plan on growing in that space affect how much sunlight other plants in your garden get? Considering how the sun moves across your garden is very helpful. Where is east? Where does the sun rise? Where is west? Where does the sun set? Over the course of the year, how does the sun's movement in the sky change? And how does that affect how much sunlight your space gets? These are very important things. My home garden in the district, I get really great sun in the summertime when the sun is high in the sky and pretty much dead straight up in the sky and going in that arc. I get pretty much full sun in my garden. However, in the spring and in the fall, I get maybe 4 hours of full sunlight per day. That's because of the way my own apartment building shades my garden. It comes in between my plants and the sun in the fall because of the way the sun moves across the sky. So I know that I can only plant I only have a very short window to plant vegetables that need longer or more full sun, longer periods of full sun per day. Considering the environment around your growing area is helpful. Are there trees? Are there buildings that are going to shade your space? How does that change over the years, or over the year, I should say? This will affect what you're growing in your space, or what you can grow, and how quickly things grow. Some plants grow taller than others and can cast shade on nearby plants. Check your seed packet to determine how much sun a plant needs for optimal growth. Most vegetables need full sun to grow optimally, to produce the amount of food that they typically produce or that you expect them to produce. You need full sun. Some plants can tolerate partial shade. Some plants like partial shade. Check out your seed packet to determine how much sun your plant needs. And that will determine whether or not you can plant it in your garden or where is the best space to plant it in your garden. Sunflowers are a really popular thing to grow in a small urban space because they look so beautiful and because they're so easy to grow. However, they grow very tall, and because they grow very tall, they can cast shade on other plants, especially if they're planted in a long line or in a big patch. That can prevent sun from getting to certain parts of your garden because of the way the sun moves across the sky and interacts with those sunflowers. It would not be a good idea to plant tomatoes in the shade of your sunflowers because as your tomatoes are reaching maturity and need full sunlight to produce a delicious, ripe tomato, those sunflowers are also growing taller and taller, and by the time your tomatoes are ready to start ripening their fruit, they may not have enough sunlight to ripen their fruit efficiently or quickly because of the sunflowers casting shade on them. Okra is another very tall plant that has very large leaves that can cast a lot of shade. This can be used as an advantage. You can grow things like lettuce underneath your okra, perhaps, because of the shade that lettuce is getting from the okra plants. In the middle of the summer, lettuce typically can't tolerate quite a lot of sun because it's so hot and it decreases the quality of the lettuce. But having that okra to shade your lettuce can help your lettuce grow healthy even in the middle of the summer. So the shade can be seen as an advantage or a disadvantage, but you have to know how to use it. What's going on in the soil? Now that we understand how we're going to calculate how many vegetable plants we can fit in our space, what we need to consider when we are designing our garden, what we're going to plant when, and where we're going to plant it, we have to think about how we're actually going to interact with the soil to get those vegetable plants to grow in it. So we should think about what is going on in the soil. And there is quite a lot going on in the soil. The soil is a habitat for many living things. Microorganisms live in the soil. Microorganism activity allows nutrients present in the soil to be used by plants. They also detoxify the soil and help plants fight disease. Microorganisms are microscopic. We can see in this picture that there are some examples of them. Soil animals can help fix nitrogen. They can also create pores in the soil, which allow for gas exchange between the atmosphere and the atmosphere that is in the soil. Soil animals can also help add organic matter through their excrement. They can also manage pests and plants, or manage the pests that affect our plants, excuse me. Soil animals, for example, earthworms, they burrow and create little cavities in the soil as they are moving around in the soil looking for food. That helps water and air get into the soil, which is very important. We'll talk about that in a second. The earthworms also poop in the soil. Their excrement helps feed the soil and helps improve and increase the amount of nutrients that are present in that soil. Earthworms also help break down larger pieces of organic matter and turn them into smaller pieces. Turning them into smaller pieces allows those nutrients to be released in simpler forms more quickly, which allows them to be available for plants to use much more rapidly. Frequently, although compost is very rich in nutrients, those nutrients are not available to plants because they're in such complex forms. They're tied up with lots of organic matter and other chemical bonds that they're attached to in the form of compost. You think about an apple. How long does it take for that apple to decompose and turn into a simple nitrogen or a simple phosphorus? It takes quite a long time and quite a lot of activity. Compost is a stage in between it being a raw element on the periodic table and being a thing that looks like soil. Compost needs to be broken down by things like microorganisms and earthworms over time in order to be able to be used by plants, in order for the nutrients in that compost to be used by plants. Microorganisms and soil animals and things that happen in the soil must break those complex chemicals or complex compounds down to create simpler forms of the elements that plants need to survive, such as nitrogen and phosphorus and potassium. I hope that makes sense. Plant roots also provide food to microorganisms and soil animals. They add organic matter and fix nutrients and improves the soil structure. Here we have a beautiful drawing, beautiful illustration of a healthy soil ecosystem. There are quite a number of different living creatures we can observe in this picture. We have a mushroom growing. We've got plants growing. It looks like there are many different types of plants, not just one. There's a bird. There looks to be some sort of millipede looking thing on the left, and there looks to be quite a number of earthworms. There may even be a mouse. It looks like there perhaps is a grub above that mouse, and there are ants. And I'm sure even invisible to the naked eye, there are thousands, if not millions or billions of microorganisms hanging out just in this small piece of soil that we're seeing in this picture. A healthy soil ecosystem looks just like this. So let's talk about microbes and how they affect plants. We can see the picture on the left. The plant is fairly small. The picture on the right, the plant is a little bit bigger. We can see in the image on the left that there's this small little cloud towards the top of that blue box, and those are the microbes. There is not as many microbes in that box on the left as there are on the right. This picture is trying to describe or illustrate how higher levels of microbes, of beneficial microbes, can actually help the plant take more nutrients from the substrate that it is in, take more nutrients from the soil that it is in. Those microbes help break down those mineral rock particles into more simpler forms, such as phosphorus, that are available to the plants. The microbes help turn more complex chemical compounds into more simple ones. The plants need the simple stuff. They can only take up the simple stuff. They can't take up that complex stuff. They need the microbes in the soil to help them do that. And the way the microbes work are kind of like scissors, because they produce enzymes that release phosphorus, which can be taken up by the plants. The enzymes cut other pieces of chemical material, of different pieces of compounds, into smaller, more simpler ones, which increases the simplicity of the phosphorus that is in the soil, which makes it easier for those plants to take them up and to use them to grow the food that we eat. Soil microbes also help change the pH of a soil and water solution. We talked in the propagation workshop about how the pH, the acidity or the alkalinity of soil affects how plants can take nutrients out of that soil. Microbes can help create a suitable environment or a suitable pH around those plants' roots to allow that plant to take up as much phosphorus or as much of any other nutrient as possible. It is important to note that these microbes will change the pH of the soil directly around the roots, maybe not all over the entire field, but just around the roots of the plant. Your soil pH may not change if you take a soil test between having less amounts of soil microbes versus more amounts of soil microbes. However, the greater the amount of soil microbes, the more chance you will have of the microbes messing with the pH around those plants' roots to help that plant take up more of the nutrient that it needs. I hope that makes sense. These are some wonderful illustrations. Just like they did with their enzymes, microbes can make complexing agents like organic acids that act like tweezers to pluck phosphorus from particles to be then used by plants. So this is another way that microbes can basically pick the parts of a more complex compound that the plants need and just pick that element right out of them and make it available to the plants. They're pretty incredible. Similar to the enzymes and the tweezers, they can dissolve the minerals that contain iron and phosphorus and other nutrients that plants need to survive and be healthy. They can dissolve those minerals out of those larger particles. Roots and microbes work together to help create a healthy soil environment suitable for plants. We can see on the top here, a soil without plants, there are not a lot of bacteria that can harness nitrogen from the atmosphere and pump it into the soil to be available for plants to use. We see a bare soil on the top, not a lot of microbial growth. Second picture down, we see soil with plants, but no legumes. There is quite a lot more bacterial activity. That is, even though there's a lack of legumes, those bacteria are working with the roots of that non-legume plant to take nitrogen from the atmosphere and pump it into the soil to be able for plants to be able to use. Legumes are the king of fixing nitrogen. They take nitrogen from the atmosphere and pump it into the soil for storing and for use later by plants. Now, because the way that these legumes work is that they help that bacterial environment thrive underneath the soil. That makes legume plants most suitable for fixing nitrogen. The way the legumes' roots work are easier for the bacteria to work in a way that helps the plant fix nitrogen. That actually helps the bacteria fix the nitrogen into the soil. So we can see here, one, the effect of legumes in terms of nitrogen fixation, but also the influence of plants' roots being able to actually create an environment where this bacteria can interact with the nitrogen to actually fix it into the soil. The more roots we have, especially the more legume roots, the higher the amount of nitrogen bacteria will be able to fix, because they have a more suitable habitat in the soil. Having these microbes in the soil is extremely helpful for many reasons that we've already talked about. But there's a type of fungus, mycorrhizal fungus, which really helps plants' roots. This mycorrhizal fungus can only be present in a healthy soil where there is an environment suitable for fungi and bacteria and soil microbes to live in. We can see the corn plant on the left has just normal roots, while the corn plant on the right is being aided by the mycorrhizal fungi, which are actually extending the reach of that corn plant. It's extending the reach of those corn plants' roots to be able to retain moisture or to suck up moisture. These mycorrhizal fungi actually act sort of as an extension for the plant's roots in terms of getting them moisture. You can see the corn plant on the right is a little bit further down the road to maturity than the corn plant on the left. Having these mycorrhizal fungi and these microbes and these roots in our soil is something that we're looking for. We're trying to create that environment because of all the benefits that it has for our plants to make nutrients more available. That being said, it's not just about the microbes that are in our soil. The way that the microbes get into the soil or are allowed to proliferate or grow or thrive in the soil is because of the soil structure. There are pores in the soil. Some soil has more pores than others. Soil pores allow water and air to move through the soil profile. Soil pores are created by the space between the soil particles. A mix of both small and large particles creates optimal conditions for soil organisms and plant roots. Having both these small and large chunks, you can imagine what it's looking like underneath the soil. You can imagine, I'm trying to think of a really good example, but I can't think of one. Having small and large pieces underneath that soil will create a very wide diversity of the space of those soil pores, the size of those soil pores. Because they're small and large, there may be a pore that might be really small at the top of the soil profile, but get larger and larger as we move down into the soil profile. Having these different sizes of particles help create a good soil structure. We don't want just small particles. We don't want just large particles. We want a really healthy mix of both. And we're talking about basically the clumps that we see when we dig up, when we put a shovel in the soil and we dig up a ball of soil. We're looking to see, large and small aggregates or chunks or particles in that soil. That means we have a more healthy soil structure. A healthy, well-aggregated soil allows excess water to drain away from the root zone, but hold on to enough water to meet a plant's needs. It allows gas exchange to take place between the soil and atmosphere, creating a suitable environment for beneficial microorganisms. Saturated soil has poor gas exchange and creates buildup of anaerobic soil microorganisms. We talked earlier about the benefits of microorganisms. Those microorganisms need a suitable environment. They need a suitable habitat to be able to do their thing, to be able to actually exist in the soil. That environment is a soil that has a healthy gas exchange. It doesn't become waterlogged and stay waterlogged for a long time. It also doesn't dry out and drain right away. It allows enough water to be present in the soil to meet the plants and microorganisms' needs, but allows excess water that may create an anaerobic environment to drain away from the root zone. It's kind of like a compost pile. If you don't turn your compost pile, you may experience a buildup of anaerobic microorganisms or a bad smell. This is also going to happen if you don't add things like straw or carbon materials, which will help that nitrogen have something to break down. Instead, it'll just turn into gas. That nitrogen will have something to attach to. So in this way, we need to have a good soil. We need to have a good air and water exchange in the soil. So gas exchange from the atmosphere outside the soil needs to be taking place fairly frequently. All this to say, we just need a well-aggregated soil. It needs to be able to breathe. And we can accomplish that by trying to encourage both large and small particles of soil to exist in our field or in our growing area. A healthy soil structure allows plants' roots to explore a larger portion of the soil profile, increasing the plant's access to nutrients and water. You can imagine in a very hard, compacted driveway, and even a plant as hardy as okra won't be able to expand its roots very far into that soil profile because of how compact it is. How many cars have run over that in the past few hours? How many cars have run over that in the past few years? There's not a lot of space for air or water to penetrate that soil. Therefore, there's also not going to be a lot of space for that plant's roots to penetrate the soil profile. However, in a nice field that has a lot of organic matter, perhaps that okra plant will be able to explore way deeper into the soil profile if the conditions are right, and that okra plant will get much, much bigger because it will be able to find more water in that soil. Its roots will be much larger because it has more space to expand. It's easier for those roots to expand. So that way it is able to access more nutrients because it can access a much larger portion of the soil. I hope that makes sense. So on the left here, we have a picture of a or maybe a not so well aggregated soil. You can see that there are plant roots, quite a few, but the soil looks pretty chunky and compact. There are a lot of larger particles here, or at least a lot of larger chunks. You can see there's sort of one big pore running down the center towards the top of the soil. Then there's a couple more towards the bottom. You can imagine that the soil doesn't really allow water or air to penetrate these two big chunks on the top, left and right. However, the picture on the right seems to be much more well aggregated. You can tell that there are a lot more roots that you are seeing coming out of the soil, which is a general sign that plants are able to get more nutrients out of the soil. They're able to explore that soil a lot more easily than the plants on the left. Sorry, than in the soil on the left. We can see in the picture on the right that there are large particles and smaller particles and sort of a mix of both. And especially on the top here, we can see lots of pores or areas where water and gas might be able to move. So this soil on the right looks like has a lot better structure than the soil on the left. We're going for what it looks like on the right. To illustrate more what I'm talking about, here is a illustration of compacted soils and how water travels across compacted soils. One, the water can't reach very deeply into the soil. That causes the pooling up on the surface of the soil. The pooling up on the surface of the soil drags more soil with the water as the water continues to find the lowest spot in your field, basically causing erosion. As that water pulls up on the surface of the compacted soil, because it cannot penetrate quickly or deeply into the soil, it's going to hang out on the top. And as that water pool increases and gets heavier and heavier, it will start to move more quickly across the top of the soil. And that will take more soil with it. And that's basically just eroding your field. All of the good soil that you need to be growing your crops in is washing away into the river, which is bad for the river. It's also bad for your plants. However, if we plant a radish cover crop in our field before we plant our main crop, we can see how this radish cover crop is shooting really deep and large taproots deep down into the soil. And that's helping break up larger particles and break up the compaction that might be happening in the soil. This is creating larger pore space for water and air to be able to exchange and percolate through the soil's profile. After the radish cover crop was killed, we can see that even during a heavy rain, the soybeans are healthy and the soil is not eroding. That is because there are larger channels in the soil for both the roots to explore and for the water to be absorbed into. Here is a picture of a daikon radish. This daikon radish was most likely planted in the fall or in the late summer. The cold frost of the winter killed this radish, but we can see that it has left a giant hole in the middle of our field. This giant hole is a pathway for air and gas to get into our soil, which will help microbes in our soil have a healthy habitat for them to live and help out our plants in the way that they do so well. Another example of cover cropping or increasing the penetration of roots into the soil can help out your plants. So we have our soybean crop before our cover crop on the left in summer one, looks healthy. However, we planted a cereal rye cover crop in the fall, and those cereal rye plants, their roots extended way deeper into the soil. And it also seems like they are more fibrous, so maybe they help to break up some of the larger particles and stabilize the structure on the top surface, right near the top of the soil. Because those roots penetrated more deeply and more prolifically on the top of the soil, our soybean plants in summer 2 are going to have a much more deep root zone because those rye roots have actually opened up the pores in the soil for those soybean roots to actually explore. Now that we can understand a little bit about what's going on in the soil, we can think about how to prepare it. Now, when we're thinking about preparing our bed, Generally, it is hard to plant a vegetable without disturbing the soil in some way. However, disturbing the soil in many ways breaks up the aggregation or breaks up the soil structure that is present in the soil. Most of the time, this is a negative phenomenon. So most of the time when we're actually doing this soil working, or we're playing in the soil a little bit, we're destroying that soil structure. It is actually creating a less suitable environment for plants in some ways, because it's destroying that environment that those microbes are already existing in and already hopefully pretty happy. However, we can imagine a very compact clay field, and just by bringing in a piece of tillage equipment, such as a rototiller, or coming in with a hoe or a digging fork or something like that, and fluffing up the soil a bit, that will increase the amount of aeration, or the amount of gas exchange that can happen between the atmosphere and the soil, which will create a better habitat for our plant's roots. However, over time, and repeatedly doing this can actually create a more negative, a less habitable environment in the soil for those plants than it was originally. We'll talk a little bit about that. So in this picture, we've got a gentleman using a broad fork. This is a very common and awesome hand tool that is very frequently used to prepare an area for planting vegetables. It basically allows you to break up compaction that might be fairly deep in your soil, maybe about 12 inches deep. It helps break up that layer in the soil that might be compacted because of walking on top of it or driving equipment on top of it. It helps that sort of break up a little bit, which allows water to get through, which allows air to get through, and also plants roots to get through. However, the broad fork doesn't really disturb the soil structure very much, because it's only penetrating the soil as much as these small 6 tines are on the bottom here. So those are the only things going in, and it's also not flipping the soil on top of each other or on top of itself. It's not spinning it up like a blender. It's just sort of popping it open, letting some air get in, but it's not actually pulverizing it in any way. So that allows more air and more water to get into the soil, but it keeps the soil structure more close to the state that it was in originally. Therefore, keeping that environment, preserving that environment that our soil microbes are hanging out so well in. So we just alluded to it a little bit, tillage. Tillage is a term hopefully all of us have heard. Basically, doing something to the soil to get it to a plantable stage. Generally, that involves some sort of machine that spins and cuts into the soil. This is good in some ways, in some situations, but is also bad in other situations. So some of the pros of tilling, some of the good parts of tilling: it increases the amount of available nutrients to plants in the soil. Because it breaks up that soil structure very quickly, and the plant's roots are able to explore it very easily, there are a lot of available nutrients in the soil to those plants. It creates a light, fluffy soil structure that makes transplanting and direct seeding very easy. We can imagine that, running a rototiller on the top of a compacted field will make it much more easier for us to plant than trying to, dig up with a broad fork and plant into it afterwards. Because it's nice and light and fluffy, and it's been chopped up in a blender very recently, it's very easy for us to, gently make a small hole and plant some seeds into it. Tilling can increase the temperature of the soil in the spring and can reduce moisture, which is a really good thing, especially in Maryland. Sometimes we have very swampy, wet weather in our fairly heavy clay soil out in Maryland. In the spring, it can be difficult for us to actually get our transplants in on time, because the spring is generally wet. It's generally more difficult for us to use heavy equipment or to even walk on the field when it's that wet. Tilling can help that, although it's not a good idea to till a wet field. Tilling can basically just help us get into the field a little bit more quickly. You'll find that even in a raised bed and a wooden box, if you fluff up the soil with a digging fork a day or two before you're scheduled to transplant, you'll see that that soil will dry out a lot more quickly than it would if you had just left it how it is. That's because you're increasing the amount of air that's able to get into the soil, which is going to dry it out. Tilling can also help you kill weeds. It also allows most plants to outcompete weeds after planting. If you were to till your garden area and then immediately transplant your transplants a week or a day or two after you do your tillage event, you can imagine that most of the weeds that had been living there before will be very disturbed and will either have to have quite a bit of time to catch back up and actually start growing again, or they'll be totally destroyed, meaning that any weeds that come up later will hopefully be farther behind your transplants or your main crop, even if you direct seeded it, and those weeds will be at a lower stage of growth, and your main crop will be able to outcompete those weeds. However, we just talked about soil structure and how microbes love to hang out in that really healthy soil structure. Tilling destroys that soil structure. It basically takes all of those large and small particles, those large and small soil aggregates, and makes them all the same size. You can see that in a newly tilled field, there are not a lot of small and large pieces of soil left in that field. It all kind of looks the same. Tillage also doesn't leave any residue on the soil surface, which can increase our chance of erosion if we get a rain or a heavy rain especially. That residue on the surface helps keep the soil where it is. It helps disperse the force of the rain particles or the water particles from the rain hitting the soil, which can actually loosen the soil and allow it to wash off of the field more easily. Tillage, we can imagine that we've got this basically this big spinning blender device that's spinning vertically in our soil. And that's tilling up our field and creating a great soil structure. But at the bottom end of that tillage implement, that implement is actually smearing the bottom of that soil, wherever the bottom of that tiller is hitting. It's actually sort of smearing it out from the weight of it and the action of it spinning so quickly, or spinning actually at all. And this can create what's called a plow pan, or a compacted zone in your soil profile, pretty much at the same level, that is very hard for water or air to get through. It'll also make it hard for plants' roots to get through. For example, if you're trying to grow carrots in a field that has a very heavy plow pan because you've tilled it twice a year for the past 10 years, those carrots will reach a certain point in their growth and their roots won't be able to penetrate anymore, which could cause you not getting a good carrot. It could also prevent you from getting a carrot at all. So a plow pan is something that we should be very concerned about for considering tillage. Plow pans are generally created by frequent tillage. Because tillage usually requires the use of equipment, either small or large, that equipment is going to be probably heavier than a human being or any sort of hoe or garden tool that we're going to use to prepare the soil. The heavy equipment can actually compact the soil and create a situation where water and gas can't penetrate the soil's profile very easily. So that creates a more anaerobic environment in the soil, which is not really suitable for plants. Tilling also, because of its movement in the soil so deeply, it can actually bring weed seeds that have laid dormant in the lower areas of the soil profile and bring them up to the top of the soil profile where they're actually able to germinate. So in one way, tillage can help us kill the weeds that exist, but it will also bring more weed seeds to the surface, which will create a weed problem sometime, or maybe not a weed problem, but it will create more weeds in the future. Maybe not more weeds, but it will create some weeds. Nutrients will burn out of the soil if we continue to till it too much. If we till it once,
lots of nutrients are actually released to the atmosphere because of how much air is able to surround those nutrients, because of how much gas is being exchanged with the soil. A lot of it is just sort of evaporating because it's all exposed to the atmosphere. It's all exposed to air. So having that large and small soil structure with defined pores in the soil structure can keep those nutrients in the soil without having too many actually be released into the atmosphere because of their interaction with the water and air. Tilling frequently just basically causes our nutrients to evaporate into the soil or evaporate into the atmosphere. However, initially, after that initial tillage, there will be more nutrients available to plants right away. So here are two implements or two pieces of equipment that are frequently used in agriculture to do this tilling process. On the left, we have a walk-behind tractor with a rototiller attachment on the back. Basically, looks like about an 8-inch or a foot deep there, getting into the soil there with a some sort of spinning chopper, and that's spinning and chopping the soil. And you can see to the right of the image, behind where the rototiller is operating, the soil is nice and fluffy. The structure looks a lot more fine than it does on the left side of the image, where it looks a little bit more diverse. This looks like it's preparing a very beautiful seed bed for us. It looks like we can plant right into it. It'll be really easy to get into that soil. On the right, we've got a tractor, which it looks like has some sort of vertical discs on it, which seem to be breaking up the soil as it drives down the field. And we can see that the soil on the right side of the frame, especially directly behind the tractor implement, that red portion, looks a lot more fine and compact than the soil does on the left, which has a lot more larger aggregates. Zone tillage. Zone tillage is basically concentrating your tillage on a small portion, a small row of your field or of your bed. By focusing your tillage only on certain parts of the field, you eliminate the total amount of tillage that's going on in your field. You're only going to be tilling up small sections while leaving larger sections untilled. Because those larger sections, or however big they are, because those sections that are untilled are left to remain untilled, that will allow those microorganisms to remain in that soil rather than getting brought to the surface and destroyed by tillage or exposed to the atmosphere through the amount of air that tillage brings into the soil. Zone tillage also allows like I said, the structure to sort of stay the same. It allows those pores that are created by water moving through the soil and roots growing in the soil to remain as they are, which will keep the environment healthy, which will keep earthworms around, which will keep all of those good things around. Some pros of zone tillage: it minimizes soil disturbance by focusing that tillage only on a small spot. Heavy equipment does not need to travel on the field as frequently. Generally, zone tillage only requires one tilling event, whereas in this picture, on the right, especially with the green tractor and the red implement, this field definitely had some sort of disturbance before this red implement was brought on top of it. I can tell by the way the soil is moving that they used a mold board plow, which is basically just a big old chisel that flips the soil that is on the bottom of the soil profile to the top. This sort of flips it over. If there's grass growing on the soil, on the top of the soil, after you run the mold board plow, that grass will be face down and the roots of that grass will be face up towards the sky. And then this disc implement is brought on top of the field to make it a more fine seed bed, to break up those larger pieces so they can plant probably something like a grain. However, the zone tillage, you only have to travel on the field once to do your tillage event for the most part, which significantly reduces the amount of compaction that's going into your field or happening on your field, because you have to drive the tractor on it less. Because of this, nutrients have less of a chance of burning out. through the use of tillage. Whereas in a normal tillage system, we're tilling the whole field. The nutrients that are remaining in that untilled strip, they're unchanged. They're not going to be burning out. While the nutrients that are in that tilled strip might be burning out more quickly, the amount of nutrients that are burning out in total on our field are reduced by quite a lot. Because zone tillage disturbs only small portions of the field or the planting area, erosion is much less likely. That soil isn't nice and fluffed up. It still hopefully has some roots or some debris on the surface, some sort of plant residue or debris to keep the erosion down. This will allow erosion to take place less prevalently, less rapidly, because there is less tillage going on, because the soil is, more of the soil is left undisturbed. However, in zone tillage, soil is not disturbed as heavily, which can make planting a little bit more complicated. If you're using a big tractor, which we'll see a picture of in a second, we're going to have to make sure that when we're using our seeder implement, that we're driving right on top of those areas that we tilled and not accidentally going off course into the areas that were not tilled, which will make many of our seeds probably not germinate or not come up well or give us a crop at all. Zone tillage requires more precise calibration, like we just talked about. Design of a field is critical in creating a zone tillage system. In an urban landscape, we have a little bit more control over how we plant, because we're not having to use large pieces of equipment, because we're not planting millions and millions of plants at a time like we would be doing if we were planting soybeans in a large plot of acres. We can only till the small area that we are about to transplant into by using a trowel, using a hand trowel, digging a small circle, just loosening up the soil that will be immediately around that plant's roots and nothing else, leaving pretty much all of the space other than the small, let's say 4 square inch area that you're going to be transplanting into. In an urban landscape, we can control this because we're usually using our hands. We can be a little bit more creative. It doesn't have to be in straight lines. Here is an example of zone tillage on a large scale. It looks like they are zone tilling right into a cover crop of some sort of clover, probably crimson clover. So we can see that maybe about 4 feet apart on this red toolbar here that's attached to the back of this green tractor, there are several rolling baskets, which in front of them have small discs and coulters, which are actually, and a chisel, which is actually disturbing just a small, maybe 4-inch wide, 6-inch wide strip on this field. Now we're opening up a 6-inch wide strip every 3 or 4 feet, perhaps, based on how far apart these small black pieces are attached on this toolbar. So we can control where we're actually tilling. We can see that most of the soil on this field is actually remaining undisturbed. So that creates this technique creates an area, a small strip for us to plant right into, which will be nice and fluffy because it has been tilled. But a lot of the soil will not be disturbed, which will keep a lot of those nutrients in there, which will keep a lot of those microorganisms in there, which will allow the structure to continue to proliferate and increase and improve over time as more nutrients and as more moisture and plants' roots and microorganisms and plant animals live in that soil. The earthworms are still digging, they're still making holes through the soil. The plants' roots are still penetrating more deeply and more proliferically in the soil when we do this type of tillage, because there's less disturbance. However, we are running a large tractor on it. We can see that we're probably going to be compacting quite a bit of our field. If we're doing things on a large scale, this might be a risk that we can afford. However, in a small urban environment, there most likely is not going to be a place for this sort of thing. However, we can imagine what it would be like if we were to do this by hand, using a garden fork or a trowel or some sort of hoe to create strips in our field or in our raised bed
that will just be the areas where we're planting our vegetables rather than disturbing the whole raised bed or the whole field to get our plants in. Here's a close-up of how these zone tillage implements work. In a large scale, of course, like I said many times already, you need some sort of equipment to really do that. But in an urban landscape, you might not need that. No-till. No-till is another method of preparing our soil, which is getting quite a lot of ground, quite a lot of traction, quite a lot of attention these days because of its very great ability to preserve the environment and preserve the nutrients in our soil and all of the good activities, all of the good life forms that are hanging out in there. So no-till is basically the process of planting your crops into a field that has not been tilled at all. This might seem fairly difficult from the things that we've mentioned before, especially in the tillage slide where we talked about how tilling can actually help you, physically get those plants into the soil because it creates a loose space. No-till requires a very healthy soil structure that will allow you to actually, it might not be as easy as planting into a tilled area, but you'll still be able to do it. It won't be like planting into a compacted driveway that has been driven on for years. So no-till requires us to sort of create a healthy soil structure before we're really, or at least a suitable soil structure before we're really, planting our crops. And that can be performed through cover cropping, which we've talked about a little bit before. In the daikon radish, or in the radish cover crop image, we saw that the daikon radish actually improved the soil structure and improved the amount of water that could infiltrate, or increase the amount of water that could infiltrate into the soil by creating those long pores into the soil. So by planting certain cover crops, we can actually loosen the soil quite a bit, allow more gas exchange to take place, allow more water to penetrate more deeply into the soil, and it'll also allow plants' roots to explore that soil a lot more easily. For no-till, the pros are the soil structure stays intact. Beneficial bacteria and organisms are not destroyed through being spun up and exposed to the sun or exposed to the atmosphere. Typically, a high amount of crop residue is left on the field, which acts as a mulch and holds soil moisture and decreases soil temperature. So that residue of straw or whatever the cover crop was that you killed on the top of the soil, that is going to act as a mulch and will hold the moisture in, will decrease the soil temperature. It will also prevent erosion. Now, decreasing the soil temperature is not necessarily a bad thing, or not necessarily a good thing. Usually it is seen as a bad thing because typically plants need a higher soil temperature to be able to germinate and be able to actually grow their roots. Because of this, no-till systems deal with an issue of trying to get into the field early. And like we said, it's usually wet and cold in the spring. Tilling allows us to warm up the soil by increasing the amount of oxygen and atmosphere that is inside that soil, so it dries out more easily. But we can imagine if we just leave that soil untilled, it's going to take a lot of time for the sun and the wind and the air to actually dry out that soil. So using no-till, that is kind of a drawback, but it can decrease the soil temperature in the hot summer, which is good for some plants. Some plants, if they're getting too hot, especially around their roots, they slow their growth down quite a bit. So decreasing the soil temperature when the plants are growing, especially when it's really hot outside, is a good thing. But decreasing the soil temperature at a time like the spring when you're trying to plant your stuff, not necessarily the best. I digress. Another pro, nutrients are, that should say not burned out. Nutrients are not burned out of the soil because they're not being exposed to the atmosphere. They're not being exposed to the sun. Those microorganisms are not being destroyed by that action of bringing a piece of heavy equipment to spin the soil. Erosion is greatly reduced because there's more residue on the top of the soil, because that soil structure has remained intact, which will allow more water to penetrate more deeply into the soil, therefore reducing the amount of water that pools up on the surface
and then washes away into the stream or waterway. Generally in no-till, we're not using and generally in no-till, we're not using equipment as frequently. Because we're not using tractors and walk-behind tractors as frequently to mow, till, make beds that we would normally do during a regular tillage system. Generally for no-till, we really only have to mow our cover crop, plant our cover crop, mow our cover crop, plant our main crop, and then plant another cover crop. Generally, these require less heavy equipment and requires obviously a lot less passes on the field. In tillage system, you'd have to mow, then disc, then spade, then make your bed, then do it all over again. Cons. Some cons for no-till is it's more complicated to create a suitable seed bed for transplanting or an area for crops. More complicated to create a suitable seed bed or transplanting area for crops. So depending on whether or not we're direct seeding or we're transplanting, having a no-till system might make it a little more complicated for us to actually get those plants into the ground, whatever form they might be, whether they're transplants, little seedlings already, or if they're just seeds that haven't germinated yet. Another con, if we're doing a no-till system and we already have a lot of compaction in our field, it is going to be difficult for our no-till system to remedy that compaction. Like we saw, the daikon radish cover crop can do a really good job in remedying that compaction. However, in more heavy soils, it might take longer for that daikon radish crop to really, more plantings of that daikon radish crop, maybe 3 or 4 cover crop seasons of having those daikon radishes in to actually get the soil broken up enough so that compaction problem isn't already there. However, if we're using a piece of equipment, we can use a chisel plow to actually till very, very deeply into our soil and actually break up that compaction physically without having to utilize the plant's roots to actually break up that compaction. So tilling can actually make the compaction go away faster, but over time it can actually contribute or create that compaction issue. However, if we're doing no-till, it might be hard to break that initial compaction, but after we break that initial compaction, we could do that with the tillage system and then start our no-till. But if we just did it through the use of a daikon radish cover crop, it would take longer, but our soil structure would be a lot more, it will be a lot healthier because we're not running that equipment. We're not actually tilling that much. It's just going to take us a bit longer. Tilling is a little bit quicker. No-till is definitely longer. No-till seems to have way better long-term results than breaking up compaction with a tillage implement. I hope that makes sense to you. No-till can also create a lot of heavy residues on the surface of the soil, and that can harbor insects and also tie up nitrogen. Because most of the crop residue turns into a very high carbon material. For example, if you cut your grass, it turns from green to brown over a few days. Once it's brown, that nitrogen is basically evaporated into the atmosphere, whereas the carbon is still hanging out on top of the soil. In order for that carbon-rich straw or grass cutting to actually be reabsorbed into the soil and fully break down, it needs to take nitrogen from the soil to do that process. Nitrogen from the soil will find that high carbon material and start to break it down. And because that nitrogen is busy breaking down that high carbon material, there will be less available to your plants. And that can cause your plants to not grow as prolifically, especially as they're growing from small plants into large plants. And that can cause an issue. It can create a timing issue, or it can create an issue where your plants aren't receiving enough nitrogen at all because so much is being tied up. Let's say you have a wood chip mulch on top of your bed. Because those wood chips are so large and they're really, really high in carbon, it's sucking up a lot of nitrogen from the soil to actually break down those wood chips. And that's allowing or preventing more nitrogen from getting to the plants because it's so busy breaking down those wood chips. For no-till, especially on a large scale, you do need some sort of equipment. Having some sort of equipment that can actually like break through that heavy residue on the top of your surface, that heavy mulch on the top of your soil surface. A tractor implement is going to be a lot easier and quicker if you're managing a large space than if you were to not use a piece of equipment. However, in urban agriculture, we have the ability to use our hands. So this might not be a con. It can actually be one of the beautiful things about urban agriculture, where we don't need large pieces of equipment that use a lot of energy. We can just, scoot that mulch out of the way. We can use our trowel to, break up any sort of, minor compaction that might be in the area that we're trying to transplant that vegetable plant. And we can just do that all by hand. We don't have to worry about heavy equipment. It's a good thing. Here looks like perhaps a peanut or soybean, probably soybean crop that has been planted into a residue. This looks to be like a corn residue because I can see some corn husks on the ground, but this is an example of no-till. Because this residue is still on the surface, we can be pretty dang sure that there wasn't that big disc run over it or that spinning implement on the back of a walk-behind tractor. That would have just vaporized all of that residue on the top and brought it and forced it way deeper into the soil profile. In this picture, we can see how it's all on the top of the soil, on the top of the surface of the soil. And it's actually acting as a mulch, keeping the plants that are living on the field, and they're keeping them happy, they're keeping the moisture in the soil, while also preventing the soil from getting too hot. These plants have already germinated. It looks like it's probably, the sun is out. It looks like it might be spring or fall perhaps, and the plants are looking healthy. It doesn't seem like temperature is a big deal. Furthermore, all of this residue on the top is going to increase or allow that the soil structure on the bottom to continue to improve because it's not being disturbed, and because over time the plants that are planted here, that are growing here, those roots are going to be exploring all of those little tiny pores, and that mulch is just going to be protecting those pores from getting flooded out by water if there are any heavy rains, and will also prevent any soil from, or at least most soil, from running off of the field during a heavy rain event. So this is an example of a no-till system, or what no-till might look like, especially on a large scale. Here we have a roller crimper. This is typically a tractor implement that is used to flatten the cover crop. There's basically just pushing it down, and these strips of metal, these thin strips of metal, are actually cracking the stalks as the cover crop is pushed to the ground. These small strips of metal actually break and sort of tear into them and chop up the plants a little bit so that they don't come back. It's important when you're doing a no-till system to try and make sure that your cover crop does not regrow and create an issue of competition between your cover crop residue or your young re-germinating cover crop and your main crop. This is just one way to kill a cover crop. Some people use a lawnmower or a flail mower. Some people use herbicide. This is a really great resource from the USDA. I encourage you to click on it. It's a comparison of the different types of tillage systems: no-till, zone-till, total till. It'll hopefully do a little bit of a better job than I can of describing these different systems and how they work and how they affect your soil. So I just inserted this here in case you're working with equipment of any kind. It can be working with a hoe, it can be working with a walk-behind tractor, it can even be working with a larger tractor. Determining the size of your planting beds and walkways. Even in a space where you're using raised wooden beds or raised garden boxes, it's a good idea to think about how much space will be between those beds. How much space will you actually devote to walking, to your walking in between them. If you're thinking about equipment it's important to make sure that when you're running your tractor on your field, especially if you're using your tractor to cultivate or to kill weeds or to perhaps spray some sort of fertilizer or pesticide on your field, it's important that those tractor tires do not actually run right on top of your crop. So if you're using equipment such as a tractor, bed and walkway size is dependent on the size of your equipment. Beds can only be as wide as the space between tractor tires. Walkways can be as wide as necessary or as narrow as the width of one tractor tire. If you're forming your beds by hand, let's say you're making raised wooden beds or you're just making a raised bed in the field with soil, the beds can be designed to whatever specifications suit you best. Consider how often you will have to bend over to reach the center of your bed when you're designing the width of your beds. Consider how much space you will need to comfortably walk through your garden to determine the width of your beds or the width of your walkways. It's really important to make sure that when you're designing your garden or you're designing your space, or you're thinking about, how I'm going to actually be operating in my field to grow and harvest vegetables, you should be thinking about, how easy is it for you to actually get to those vegetables? Do you have to bend over a really wide bed to get to the middle of it? Or do you have to just reach over gently because your beds are narrow? Are you harvesting a lot of stuff? Do you need a wagon? Do you need to bring a wagon with you in between your raised beds to actually harvest your crops into, to make it more efficient for you to grow them and harvest them and get them out of the sun more quickly so they don't degrade? Consider that. If you're perhaps in a wheelchair for any reason, it's obviously you need to be able to get in between your beds to do the things you need to do to grow your crops. Making sure you have enough space to get your wheelchair between the two beds is very, very important, of course. Making straight lines. Building or organizing your planting beds so that they follow straight lines will help maximize the planting space and make it easier for you to run equipment or any sort of hand tool through your field. If you have two lines of salad greens that are exactly the width of your hoe apart, the width of your hoe is 6 inches, the lines of your salad greens are 6 inches apart, it'll be very easy for you to cultivate by running your 6-inch hoe between those two straight lines of salad mix. You only have to do it once. If those lines are crooked, you're going to have to pay more attention to follow the contour of those lines as you're using your hoe to make sure you don't kill any of the plants that you're trying to save or you're trying to actually harvest and eat. Using a string tied to posts installed at regular and evenly spaced intervals will help you line up your straight beds, or will give you line to guide you when you make your beds. You can put posts at the extremes of your field, measure how far apart you put those posts, especially in the width, and then tie a string between all of them and just make sure that all of them are it's the same width the entire way down. And that will help you have a guide to follow when you're either making your bed or when you're planting your crops. When you're doing your square foot gardening method, you need to be able to create a grid in your planting area. And if you use a string or something that like that's more permanent and can be removed later for your convenience, that will allow you an excellent guide to make straight lines in your bed. Although you be planting in the middle of the boxes, you're sure that you will have evenly spaced boxes, and that all those boxes will be the same size if you make sure that you measure before you make your grid. Here is a video for making straight lines for garden beds. So really quickly, we talked a little bit about this already, but we'll just briefly cover some of the commonly used tools on small-scale farms that you can consider when you're actually preparing your bed or working in your garden. So on the left, we have a walk-behind tractor with a tiller implement on it. You can see the tiller coming out right below those Japanese characters, and there's small little gray tines coming out the bottom there. That's obviously going to be spinning up the soil and making it an easy structure for us to plant into. On the right, we have a larger tiller. It's probably for putting on the back of a tractor. Broad fork. We've talked quite a bit about this already. This helps alleviate compaction deeper into the soil without disturbing the soil structure as much as a tiller would. This is a really awesome hand tool. I highly recommend purchasing a broad fork, or at least trying out a broad fork in your space. A digging fork can serve a similar purpose to a broad fork. On my last farm, we did pretty much no-till by hand. But we still had to use a digging fork to sort of break up that compaction a little bit around the area that we'd be planting in. So we were planting okra, we would, every foot or foot and a half, we would pop a little hole open with the digging fork. It can work in the same way as a broad fork for planting salad mix, salad greens. We just sort of forked the entire planting area to make sure that we could get a fine enough seed bed to actually plant those salad mix seeds. But your digging fork essentially can help break up compaction deep into the soil, just like a broad fork. However, the tines are a lot smaller and more narrow, or the tines are essentially more narrow, not necessarily smaller in terms of the width of the actual tines. The tine portion itself, the amount of soil that's being disturbed by this garden fork is a lot less than a digging fork, or than a broad fork. So these are helpful tools. They're not quite as efficient as a broad fork in terms of aerating your soil, but they can be a little bit more precise and a little bit easier to use. The seed bed rake. Seed bed rake is really awesome because it helps you get that nice, flat, level, fine seed bed on the top of your soil, on the top of your planting area. So it'll make it easier for you to plant your seeds into. We'll have some demonstration videos up about how using a rake, especially a seed bed style rake, helps you get a level and fine planting surface. A flame weeder. Flame weeder is a little bit of very much a dangerous tool. However, it can be very useful as a way to kill weeds without a lot of back-breaking work and a lot of disturbing your soil. Basically, the way the flame weeder works is it's a big propane torch, and it basically burns the tops of small plants, and by burning them, it basically kills them. The flame weeder also kills or destroys any weed seeds, or any seeds actually. It could be your vegetable seeds too that it destroys. It can destroy seeds that haven't germinated yet. So by running a flame weeder on top of the field that has been somewhat prepared, you're able to kill a lot of those small weeds that are, maybe a few inches tall. You're also able to destroy pretty much all of the weed seeds that are on the surface of your soil by running that flame weeder on top, which will prevent more weeds from germinating later. This is a really great tool for planting things like carrots. Because carrots take about 14 days to germinate, you can plant your carrots, wait 1 week, flame weed that bed after that week has passed, before those carrots have germinated, to make sure that you're allowing those carrots the biggest jump on those weeds as possible. If you're able to kill those weeds the day before your carrots germinate, that automatically means that your carrots will be farther ahead of any weeds that are on the field or in the field, which will hopefully get you a more easier to manage crop and hopefully get you more carrots in general. However, if you choose to flame weed immediately as your carrots have germinated, or even if you don't know that they've germinated yet, but they're just starting to germinate right under the soil, if they're just peeking their little heads out, but you really can't see them, you're going to kill your carrots if you flame weed on top of them. So timing is critical when you're doing flame weeding on top of an already seeded bed. Using it for a bed that hasn't been planted yet is also a really good idea because it does the same thing. It helps destroy all those weed seeds and kills a lot of those smaller weeds without the use of tillage or the use of having to pick them out by hand. However, the flame weeder doesn't really work as well for larger weeds. It may kill them, but it will cost a lot in propane. You'll have to sit there with the torch pointed at the weed for, maybe up to a minute for that plant to actually, start to be destroyed. And because the plant is so well established already, it may be able to regrow from its root, even though its top has been totally burned and destroyed. A trowel. Hopefully we're all familiar with this. This is a very small shovel that can be operated by hand. It's used to plant. It's used to prepare soil for planting by, breaking up compaction. It can be used to make a small little trench for direct seeding crops like we've demonstrated in some videos. On the right here, we have a pretty cool type of trowel, much more fancy, definitely not a normal type. It's got a measuring stick on it, even down to the centimeter. One of those blades is also serrated, which allows it to chop roots or, just dig into the soil a little bit easier than a trowel would if it didn't have a serrated blade. So one that has a mark already on it can help you space plants. It can help you figure out how deep you're planting seeds or planting transplants, which in some cases can be very important. So we'll talk a little bit about the transplanting technique. We'll have some demonstration videos up of this. However, we'll just describe it briefly. I find it helpful in step 1 to mark the spaces where the plants will be transplanted according to the appropriate spacing. Doing this first helps you save time because you'll have a mark at every single part where you need to plant a plant. You won't have to figure out where that is as you're planting, which can be a little bit tricky and can cause you to lose your way if you're doing multiple things at once, such as trying to find the right space to plant the plant and actually planting that plant. Step 2, gently remove the small plants from their tray and leave one plant next to the mark. I like to lay out all of my plants in the planting area before I actually start digging holes and putting them in the ground. That way I can make sure that I have enough plants to plant in my area, where I don't have to rethink what I'm doing because I don't have enough plants. Maybe I have to make sure I prep another bed because I have too many plants. Laying them out before helps me move quickly as well when I'm planting them, just because I have to focus only on putting them in the ground. I don't have to focus on measuring and pulling out the plant from the tray and then burying it. So step 3, after my plant spaces have been marked and I've laid a plant next to each of them, I start to use a trowel or my hands if the soil is soft enough to make a hole in that soil that is approximately the size of the plant's root ball. Step 4, gently place your plant in the hole and cover it with soil. For crops such as kale, most flowers, and trees, cover the plant's root ball with soil, but do not allow soil to cover the plant's stem. For things with woody stems, like some flowers and trees, and even things like kale, planting the root ball too far below the surface and allowing the main stem of that plant to contact the soil can actually rot that plant's stem. So especially for woody trees that have already, have a woody main trunk, the bark around their main stem is woody. Covering that woody stem with soil is actually going to cause disease problems or weaken that stem by quite a bit. You want to be able to plant that tree or that woody stem right at the soil level. You don't want any soil to be burying that woody stem, but you also don't want the roots to be exposed above the soil. For plants that have adventitious roots on their stems, such as tomatoes or cucumbers, they can get buried up to their first set of leaves, basically right up to the neck where the leaves start to come out of the stem. This helps encourage more root growth. We've talked about this in the propagation video. As those adventitious roots come into contact with soil, they actually become roots that feed the plant. And that the more roots we have, the healthier the plant will hopefully be. Step 5, gently tamp or compress the soil around the plant using your hands. Be careful not to press too hard, or you will compact the soil, preventing water from reaching the plant's roots. Plants that are not tamped down may dry out faster and roots may not explore the soil. So just a very gentle press. You're not pressing a button. You're not pressing my buttons. You're not pressing an elevator button. You're not, kneading bread or kneading dough, I should say. You're just gently giving those plants' roots slight contact with that soil, just enough contact so that they will, be able to explore that soil and they know that that soil is there, but not too much compression so that there's no pores left around that soil, around that transplant that allow gas and water to penetrate the soil. Gently tamper compress the soil around the plant after you transplant it. And that concludes our bed preparation workshop. I hope you enjoyed what we were talking about today. Please feel free to shoot me an email. My email is Brian, BRIAN, .Barnes, BARNES, @UDC.edu. Please shoot me an email with any questions you may have about this lecture. I'd be happy to answer them when I find the time. And I hope you have taken a good amount of information away from this lecture. Please watch the demonstration videos that will cover some techniques that we talked about here. Thank you very much.